World leaders have commenced deliberations on aggregating pledges and goals aimed at combating climate change at the 27th edition of the United Nations Conference of Parties, or COP27, in Sharm-El-Sheikh, Egypt. Top of the agenda is how developing countries, who are the least responsible for greenhouse gas emissions but suffer the most devastating effects, would be funded. The president of this year's conference, Sami Shukri, has advocated for climate justice and the need for countries to deliver on the goals of the Climate Convention and the Paris Agreement. This is against the backdrop of concerns that world leaders are reluctant to fully commit to actions and funding that end climate change. So what are the numbers that make climate change a business conversation? The African Development Bank says the continent will need as much as $1.6 trillion between 2020 and 2030 for its own efforts to limit climate change and to adapt to the adverse effects that are already apparent. Africa accounts for just 3.8% of greenhouse gas emissions. Joining the conversation is Rukaiya El-Rufai. She's partner, sustainability and climate change, as well as public sector at PwC Nigeria. Rukaiya, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me once again.
So in the lead up to COP27, there was a meeting about 2 months ago as well in Cairo, Egypt. African ministers were present. And in some of the statements we've seen then, we've obviously known that there's tension going into this meeting. And that tension is because the West and developed countries have failed to basically fulfill the pledges and the commitments they've made over the past few years in terms of what they will give to Africa. But before we get into that, what are the demands we should expect that African countries table this week at COP27?
This is a very important question, particularly given the fact that this is a coup that is happening in Africa. So indeed, it's an opportunity for Africa to Africanize this agenda and ensure that the peculiar, priorities are brought on the agenda of COP27. So for Africa, I think what we would expect from African leaders is general agreement and consensus around adaptation. As you all know, even though Africa hasn't contributed so much to the greenhouse gas emissions, they're disproportionately, affected and impacted. We're seeing the extreme events. So even if mitigation is not a question for us, adaptation is. We've seen the floods in Nigeria where 33 of the 36 states were impacted. So, that acceleration of adaptation, and implementing the plans needs to happen. The second is the issue of finance, climate finance, where Africa, has, vulnerable economies. They have huge debt burden. The fiscal space is just so constrained versus the quantum of finance needed to even help with the adaptation and the transition. The third is just transition. That's the third, just transition, because, Africa still is resource endowed. We're still developing. We still have majority of the poor population of the world. We have energy deficits, energy poverty. So there's just a whole lot. So the question of how climate policies can be channeled for socio-economic outcomes as well to create jobs, livelihoods. So if, for example, you stop fossil fuel, what are the jobs there? How do you transition people? Yes. How do you ensure the new sectors that will pop up and, the new areas also create jobs and enhance societal outcomes? How do you ensure Africa has access to affordable energy too? So another important one is loss and damages. As the UN Secretary, if you listen to his opening remark, he said it's a moral imperative, is an issue of trust, and you have coastal economies and African economies reaping the whirlwind sown by others. So you need to invest in early signals, and there's a call for windfall tax for fossil fuel because, they're gaining a lot now, and then the question of finance and the technology, So these are the main things on the agenda for Africa. To recap: adaptation, mobilization of finance, loss and damages, and just transition as well.
Okay, so for many people, particularly Africans, let's be honest, it can be a struggle to make the connection between climate change and the flooding that's happening and the overall drive that we have for economic development and the development of the continent. So, Rukaiya, I want us to go to that now. I've worked with environmentalists, and I know one of the things they make clear is that there will be no education if kids cannot go to school because of drought or flooding. There will be no development because of these same things. But particularly for our economies that still need to develop, where is the concern? Where is the risk if Africa does not take climate change seriously? What will it cost us?
Oh, well, it's going to cost us a lot if we do not plan for adaptation. Like the UN SecGen said, we're collectively heading to a climate suicide, and he describes it as we're on our road to climate hell. And we're accelerating, our journey, and all that. So for Africa, like I said, it's an issue of adaptation. And like you rightly mentioned, just look at flood, for example. It caused displacement, lost livelihoods. Of course, we have kids in IDPs now, and it distorts schooling as well. And you look at even energy, for example, if, people don't have access to energy, ease of doing business, and we know that there's a positive correlation between energy access and socioeconomic outcomes. So it's just not, and we need to look at people are highly reliant on the agri sector for livelihoods, and even if you look at firewood, cooking fuel. It's still firewood and coal, and that employs like 45 million people. So nature-based investments as well are critical for us, and how, like I said, channeling climate policies to create jobs, to improve socioeconomic outcomes. So we're headed to disaster. We're already seeing the insecurity from drying up of Lake Chad. We're now seeing the floods with businesses recording tens of millions in losses, and it just means there will be more of that. We won't be able to plan and the impact. So every business has to, and every state has to think of the physical risks they're facing and the transition risks, and try to mitigate to survive and weather the storm.
So let's follow the money now, or maybe the lack of the money. And I say that because the long-standing goal that developed countries have to donate, to raise, to give or spend, whatever word you want to use, $100 billion a year from 2020 to help vulnerable nations to adapt to climate change largely, majorly remains unmet. So as it stands right now, COP is about 2 or so days into the conference. Before we talk about that, where are we on that goal? How much of that money has found a way towards the vulnerable countries, particularly those on the continent that need it?
So I mean, it's one of the failures of COP26. The inability to commit the developed countries to set aside that 100 billion every year, and that's what's known as that missing billions that is being reported. But when you look at the COP27 agenda, the first day is around that climate, the financing and loss and damages. It has come out strongly. It's been echoed in all the speeches at the opening ceremony. And, of course, only about 20% of that has been set aside. And there's just still a whole lot more. And, like I said earlier, it's just a moral imperative of the developed countries to especially with the loss and damages as well. So there hasn't been a lot that has been met, but there is also a private pool of climate finance that is independent of this that Africa is not leveraging. we ourselves need to do better. We need to take the science seriously. We need to take projects preparation seriously. We need to, it will be results based, and we need to convince that we have governance. So whatever we are going to put on the table should have strong commitments and a clear roadmap. Look at what Oscom has been able to, Escom for the South Africa energy producing company. It's because they did have, firm commitments, and they had a strong case, that leveraged science. So we need to take our project preparation seriously, and we need to also explore other alternatives that are there, and we need to go beyond, that moral obligations of the West to create win-win proposals for all of us.
So I want us to go deeper into that, because some of the criticism of climate finance has been that it's biased against the climate vulnerable countries, that the more vulnerable you are, the less climate financing you actually receive. And we've seen that we're just getting about 12% of the financing that the continent needs. In 2020, it was $29.5 billion versus the $250 billion that Africa needed. So when you talk about alternatives, private financing, let's go further into that. What alternatives are available to African economies, to African countries? There's the conversation around green bonds, but how effective or how much of a payout would that really give us in the long run if we do not get money from these developed countries who are majorly responsible for where the world is? What does Africa have recourse to do?
Yes. So like I mentioned, the private pool of capital is shifting to green capital. Like you rightly mentioned, capital markets are playing a key role there. They're very innovative instruments such as the green bonds, the blue bonds. There's even on the social side things like pink bonds and so on. But another market that Africa is not taking advantage of are the carbon markets. If you look at the signal from US, the United States, it's not to kind of deter fossil fuel growth, but develop an offset market. Because at the end of the day, what you want is carbon neutrality. So you just need to understand your carbon footprint, what you're emitting, and there are options for you to invest in carbon sinks. So Africa can leverage on that by nature of how our topography, our natural topography is. We can have afforestation projects. Even clean cooking is hot with carbon credits. So we can have those programs that will be funded by these carbon credits, that other emitting actors can actually offset and invest in. Then domestically, we need to improve our resource mobilization. Most African countries, their tax to GDP is low. So we also need to look inwards and see how we can expand our fiscal space, tackle the broken trust that is leading to the low tax morale. But more importantly, I truly believe in leveraging that private capital and the carbon markets. But we need the regulations, we need the markets to be established, and we also need, to have strong project preparations, to be able to access these and meet the standards of these, because they all have, international standards that projects have to conform to, and what you put forward in your proposal to access the climate finance.
All right, Rukaiya, before I let you go, let's look at this. We can't ignore the fact that these are hard times economically for everyone around the world. There's runaway inflation, cost of living is skyrocketing. The possibility of recession seems to be getting closer and closer the further we get into the year. But COP27, many believe, will likely also see some setbacks because developed countries are looking more inwards. They need to address the needs of their citizens. And somebody who's asking for you to give them money, loss and damage, reparations, whatever you call it, is going to be secondary. He's going to be further down the list than taking care of those at home. What do you really think will come of this COP conference? We have from now to the 18th. We're still warming up. we expect some pushback, some tug, some push and pull here. But what do you really think will come out of this conference, given the situation and circumstance of the world today?
Yes, like you rightly mentioned, the world is experiencing multifaceted socio-economic challenges, from the war, broken trust, shifting geopolitics, economically with rising inflation, looming recession, increased debt levels, and risks of default, and so on. And food security, energy security has been put in question, so there are setbacks, Even we witnessed with climate leaders, Europe was so ambitious, but now it's a matter of energy security, and never have world leaders been faced with short-term versus long-term dilemmas like what we're experiencing. And that's why you see in the UN Secretary's opening address, he talks about, losing the fight, and re-emphasizing that we're at a tipping point that will make some climate catastrophes irreversible. And, he just re-emphasizes that we cannot afford to lose attention on climate. He emphasizes how it's the greatest challenge of our century and can simply not be a back burner. I think, that, there needs to be the right balance, between the short-term needs. For example, Europe has to go through the winter, survive the winter. But, I honestly think these are all short-term interventions, and ultimately, it would even accelerate, their quest to reduce their dependencies on fossil fuel. Because who would want instability? So I think, because the thrust of COP27 is to move from the pledges to action. Yes. And its implementation together. So the previous COP has been able to at least rally the pledges, have the NDCs developed, but the NDCs are not strong enough to meet that 1.5 degrees global warming. Yes. So this COP will concentrate on remobilizing the focus, acknowledging those challenges, but not to lose sight of climate. And that's why finance will be discussed, because you can't move without financing. And that's why the cooperation will be sought out, and tackling some of the mistrusts between, nations on loss and damages. And specifically, they're trying to address emerging countries too, with the energy. Then the big polluters, US and China, there's a special focus on them. So I think the way to go is incentives, and, that loss and damage will go a long way, to give them more imperative. And, companies just need to think long term, and, while they're having their short-term interventions to tackle all these challenges. But I remember at the IMF World Bank spring meeting, the head of IMF said something which is very profound. She said people can survive recession, people can survive, inflation, but people cannot survive the climate, the extreme events from the climate. We're seeing the deaths and how it's disrupted. Okay. So we just can't afford not to do anything. And I honestly, truly believe that stronger NDCs will emerge and would see at least solutions to tackling climate finance and some of these challenges.
All right. We do have about a week and a half into all of this to see how things do play out. So we'll be touching base with you again sometime soon. Rukaiya El-Rufai, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me once again.
It is going to be an interesting few days as world leaders and, of course, African leaders hash out the details of what it means for the world to finance Africa's climate change needs, adaptation, mitigation, but all of it come down to the money. The African Development Bank says that the continent needs $1.6 trillion between 2020 and 2030 in order to meet its climate change demands. And we are already in 2022, and more than Each year, that money is not adding up to half of what should be coming in. And let's not also forget the conversation around the gas transmission. Many African countries have said gas is pivotal to their development. The world says we need to leave it in the ground. What happens with climate justice and a just transmission? We'll find out throughout this week and, of course, into next week. We'll be following very closely to see what develops at COP27.